Hi, Lindenwoods. We're going to read another 3 chapters of Echo Mountain by Lauren Wolk. We'll pick up with Chapter 19. Chapter 19. I left my pack with the jar of balsam and tears and dew and river water in the shed and carried the fish back out to the yard. "Where's Samuel?" I said to Esther and my mother, still at the churn. Esther looked, turned back to me. She didn't say anything. My mother said, "He must have gone in to wash the fish off his hands." I went into the cabin and left the fish in the kitchen by the pump. "Samuel!" I called. He didn't answer. I went through the kitchen to the washroom. The door stood open. Samuel wasn't in there. But something else was. I'd seen a snake or two in the washroom before, but not like this one. This one was as long as I was, black and shiny, lying in a tangle like a dropped rope in a patch of sun near the floor drain. It had pushed away the little lid we put over the drain, slithered up from its shelter under the cabin and onto the plank floor, and gone to sleep. I knew that as soon as I stepped into the room it would wake. My first thought, stomp on the floor and let it escape down that drain. My next thought, trap it. It was a black racer. I knew it wasn't a poisonous snake. My father had always said racers were harmless, though a mouse or a cricket might disagree. And so did I, since I also knew that it had a mouth full of needle teeth. I knew that it would writhe and coil in my hands if I picked it up. Heavy, smooth, angry. I knew that it would bite me if it could. I knew that I would have to try very, very hard not to shriek and holler as it twisted and whipped around my arms. But I also knew that it would make Esther scream loud enough to wake the dead. No more lullabies. One big leap and I was at the drain, my foot over it, as the snake burst from its nap and thrashed out long and swift, racing around the room like ink from a quill. I'd left the door open behind me. I couldn't let it past me out of the washroom, or it would hide and be still and come in the night to warm itself on one of us sleeping. So I lunged for it as it swept past me. It's not easy to grab a snake in full-blown panic, but I did, with both hands as close to the head as possible so it couldn't curl around and bite me. Its big eyes were wild, maybe even as wild as my own, and I suddenly saw its black and white world, felt the tight choke of a frog in its throat, its ribs arcing like slender moons inside the dark galaxy of itself, and I almost set her free. But I didn't. I made myself hold it tight, as far away from my face as I could, as I hurried out of the washroom, back to the bedroom where my father lay sleeping. I hung on with one hand while I opened the door and tossed it inside, pulling the door shut and then leaning against it, breathing so hard my lungs hurt. My hands trembled as they tried to forget the feel of that snake, the giantness of it. I saw the snake's shadow from under the door, felt it butt up against the sill, heard it scraping along the too narrow gap. I pictured it racing around the room, trying to find a way out, hole-seeking, peering into the mouth of my mother's dusty mandolin, and then, finally, slithering up the post of my father's bed, coiling on his warm belly, its tongue flicking like a little blade, its eyes wide and anxious. I knew that snakes only bit what they ate or what they tried to eat, or what tried to eat them. I knew it wouldn't bite someone sleeping. I knew Esther would come in soon from the churning. I knew she would go to my father's room to check on him, as she always did when he'd been without us for a time, which was one of the reasons why I loved her. I knew she would be the one to find the snake, and I knew that if screaming could wake my father, he would wake. Chapter 20. Before I left the cabin, I unwrapped 2 of the fish and left them for cooking, wrapped the 3rd in the oilcloth again, put it back in my pack, and took it out into the yard. "He's not inside," I said to my mother, who was scooping butter out of the churn and into a bowl in Esther's hands. "Then go find him," Esther said. I held up my pack. "I'm taking a fish to Mrs. Anderson to trade for eggs. I'll look for him on the path." My mother nodded. "And then bring him straight back for lessons," which my mother gave to me and Esther and Samuel nearly every day, rain or shine, summer or winter, sick or well, and no argument about it. Not that we were likely to give her one. We could all read, though Samuel was just starting to get the hang of it, and speak the language of numbers, and we all knew about wars and presidents and the crash that had driven us from the gray, starving town into the green and generous mountain. But I pictured the bedlam when Esther found the snake, and I imagined coming back to something besides reading and writing and arithmetic. I didn't see Samuel on the path up mountain. "Samuel!" I called more than once, but he didn't answer. Surely he was somewhere back near the cabin, maybe trying to start his own little fire with a couple of hopeless rocks. At the turn to the Andersons, I paused and looked up the path to where it dwindled into the undergrowth. Nobody went up there, except to hunt. Nobody lived up there, except the hag. Samuel wouldn't have gone up there on his own. I was sure he was somewhere down by home, maybe even in the yard by now, pestering my mother for a taste of butter straight from the churn. I pictured them all back in the cabin, Esther going along to check on my father, finding the snake, screaming like she'd been scalded, running from the room, her mouth a dark hole. My mother racing into the bedroom, the snake in a slick frenzy, thrashing toward escape, my mother slashing at it with her big knife. I told the snake I was sorry, hoped it reached the drain hole and through to safety. And then I pictured Esther and my mother trembling with fury, knowing that someone had shut that snake in with my father, knowing that it had to have been me. And I turned away from the Andersons and went farther up the mountain instead, following the path that the wild ones had left, threading my way through the undergrowth as if I were a needle looking for something to mend. I expected to see the dog up there, and before long I did. I was navigating an especially steep, rocky place when I looked up and saw him above me, staring down. One tooth hung below his lip, but I decided that didn't mean anything. He wasn't growling, he wasn't snarling, but he didn't look very friendly either. The tick on his face was revolting, and I made up my mind to yank it off when I could, if I could get close enough, if I could do it without dog bite. I said, "Hey, boy," in my calmest voice. I could smell the fish in the pack that hung from my shoulder, so I knew he could too. I had meant to trade it for eggs, but I was not in that world anymore. "I have a fish for you," I said, "for you and—" But I didn't want to call her the hag. It didn't seem polite. He took a step away and I took a step upward, and then another, turning my attention back to the climb, managing it carefully, slowly, mindful of the possibility of a fall. When I reached easier ground, I found that the dog had retreated farther, but was still near. "Why don't you lead the way?" I said. "I'll follow. Go on." Which he did, heading along what was surely his own trail. Fewer trees up here, patches of green moss, gray moss, humps of rocks everywhere, lichen and mushroom, stray feathers, and suddenly an antler like a hard white flower blooming in a nest of ivy. My father and I liked such things, the long curved set of beaver teeth we'd found near the river, a snake skin clear enough to see through, a matter of tiny diamonds and white lace that I wore in my hair until Esther plucked it out and threw it in the fire. It had smelled like lightning as it burned. A little farther along, the dog and I came through the stunted trees into a clearing, nearly flat, tucked against the topmost ledges of the mountain. There was a fire ring in the clearing, but no fire. An iron spit stretched over it, with a cauldron hanging cold and empty above, where there had once been a flame. Plenty of dead wood piled nearby, nothing cut and split. Just old branches and sticks, fallen and gathered. Nearby, between two hemlocks, an old tattered shawl hung from a line, dead leaves and a lone hawk feather caught in its weave. There was a garden bed, too, a long thin one with nothing in it, just some weeds no one had bothered to pull. At the far edge of the clearing, a little cabin nestled in a grove of red cedars. I could see that the door was open. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, no sound, no sign of life. The dog trotted to the door and turned to wait for me. Oddly, as I approached the door, he finally decided to growl. "Which is it? Do you want me here or not?" In answer, he disappeared into the cabin. When I didn't follow, he stuck his head back out the door and looked at me curiously. "All right," I said. "I'm coming." Chapter 21. I peered cautiously through the door. The cedars around the cabin greened the light coming through the windows, so it was dim inside, like being in the woods. But I could see enough. I could see that there were clothes hanging from pegs on the wall, some boots in the corner, a desk and a trunk with a humped lid. Shelves on one wall sagged with jars and bottles. There was an open-faced cupboard in one corner with more jars and some sacks, too, grain and dried apples from the looks of it. In another corner there was a cold fireplace. Alongside it sat a big copper bucket full of logs, and another smaller one with kindling. And there were candles on every flat surface. One, on the floor, had melted into a puddle, its wick burned away. I was amazed that it hadn't burned the whole place to the ground. but I knew that if I were a flame, I would rather fizzle out than ruin a place like this one. For besides the ordinary workaday business of clothes and boots and such, the little cabin was filled with other things as well. On one wall, shelves of books in all colors and sizes, like the keys of a new instrument I wanted badly to play. Hanging from the roof, dozens of faded bouquets dangling like an upside-down garden. And there was a workbench and a back wall hung all over with tools that my father would have cried to see. Beautiful tools of all kinds, as if someone had made wonderful things here. And wait! There, just on the window-sill by the door, there was something wonderful. A tiny fawn, carved from red wood, its hooves more delicate than petals, and a mouse with its tail hanging down over the edge, and a tiny squirrel, its paws tucked under its chin, watching me as I edged farther into the room. And that was when I realized the rumpled bed in the shadows along the back wall wasn't empty, as I had thought. I took a slow step forward, peering into the shadows, and saw that an old woman lay there, her face so pale it melted into the pillow and blended with the bedclothes, all of them faded and worn. I looked again at the carvings on the window-sill, and for just a moment I thought this woman might have made such things for me, left them for me to find. But she was far too old to have the face I'd seen peering at me from the woods. One of her hands, lying on the blanket, reminded me of the day I'd found a dead bird in the yard, its claws limp but curled up, like a baby's hands will curl when he's sleeping. Except there was nothing about babies here in this room. Nothing at all. Despite the books, despite the flowers overhead, despite the small wooden creatures and the handsome tools, everything here felt old and beaten and sad. The air buzzed with flies. The dog sat by the bed, waiting. I put down my pack and walked slowly closer. The woman who lay there was still, her eyes closed, but I could see that she was breathing. A dead rabbit lay next to her bed, flies drinking from its eyes. I swallowed, made myself breathe. "That's the rabbit I saw in your mouth down mountain, isn't it?" I whispered to the dog. "You were trying to feed her, weren't you, boy?" He watched me without blinking. The woman looked clean but gray, whole but broken. "Ma'am," I said softly, and then again more loudly. She didn't respond. I touched her hand. I had expected cold. I got hot instead, too hot, and I was suddenly filled with a horrible, terrible sadness, and such longing that I felt empty and stricken and poor. I touched her old apple face, even hotter, even more like the end of a sad tale. Something was very wrong with her. There was a small cloth doll tucked up in the crook of her neck. It was made out of rags, the kind my father used to polish things. I spent a moment looking at that, thinking about that, and then I pulled the blanket slowly down, past the hem of her nightdress, and saw that one of her thighs was swollen and purple, but also oddly white and almost moving, though her leg was still. I leaned closer in the dim light and realized that I was looking at a clot of maggots feasting on her leg. I dropped the blanket and stepped back, gasping, ran out into the yard, bent over, my hands on my knees, and swallowed hard, again and again, but I couldn't shake off the sight of that leg, the smell of it, the idea of her lying alone in that bed, while her leg softened with rot and those hungry worms. When I could, I stood up straight and wiped my face with my hands, pushed my hair back and away, and went into the cabin again, into the terrible raspy fizz of the flies. I stood staring at the old woman, at the rabbit on her pillow. What was I going to do? I wanted her to wake up, but to what? The sight of her own leg rotting? The dog lay down next to the bed and put his head on his forepaws, his eyes on me, his brows twitching. "What am I supposed to do now?" I said to him. But he didn't answer. Chapter 22. Fire, I thought. I would make a fire. There was plenty of dried grass and moss and leaf litter near the cabin, all of which I gathered for tinder, carrying it inside to pile near the cold hearth. I made a nest of the best bits, tucked it between some cooking bricks, and went to work with my knife and flint until the sparks caught. I had fire in moments. Carefully, I blew on the small flame until it consumed the nest and easily lit the thin twigs I fed it, then the larger twigs, then a stick and another, and then a small log, until I had a strong fire burning. I was as aware of the woman in the bed as I was of the mountain itself. The dog watched me steadily. The smoke from the fire fought off the smell of that leg, but I knew I would have to face it again soon. I had once watched my father use a hot knife to seal a wound in the palm of his hand. It wasn't a very big cut, but it had begun to fester. "Best to kill a germ before it spreads," he had said, heating the blade of the knife on the kitchen stove, and then taking it outside before pressing the tip of it hard against the wound. He had bellowed like a moose, and I had cried at how much it had smelled like food cooking. My mother had scolded him for doing that when he could have gone to the doctor instead. She had scolded him, too, for letting me watch. But he had kissed her and told her that doctors cost money, that he'd heal faster this way besides, and that I'd be better off knowing such things. Esther had wanted no part of it. Samuel had been napping, and I had been the one to learn that lesson. But this was not a small cut on the hand of a strong and healthy man. This was a serious wound, caked with maggots and pus. I thought about how else to help her. I could go get my mother, but what could she do? Some things she could do, and do well, without a second thought. And she was brave, too, brave enough to give up town, to go with my father to the mountain, to start over in a place with no roads, no doctors, almost no people. But her kind of courage had very little wild in it, very little of the mountain, which was all I had, wildness, though plenty of it, and of several sorts, not one vast thing, but as varied as trees, as flowers. I looked around the cabin. There was a mangy dog, a tick as big as a lima bean hanging above his eye. There was an old woman lying in her bed senseless, crawling with worms in a fog of blowflies, and there was me, no one else. I would begin. I would do what I could, and then I would do what I thought I couldn't do, before I went for a different kind of help. The fire was starting to settle down, so I added more wood until the heat pushed me away. The knife I carried with me wasn't big enough to do much good. I went to the tools hanging above the workbench and chose a big chisel. It would do. I wedged its blade between the burning logs. While it heated, I went to the old woman and had a good look at her. Her skin had the lines and spots of a life spent in the sun. Her hair was long and gray and tangled. "I'm going to hurt you terribly," I whispered. "I'm sorry." I didn't want to look at the wound again, but I knew I had no choice. When I did, it took my breath away. I turned to fetch the hot chisel, but that, right then, was when she woke. And that's where we'll leave off.